Segregation shaped the everyday lives of millions of black Americans for more than half a century. From schools and buses to restaurants and voting booths, racial separation was not just a social custom, it was the law. These rules decided where people could live, learn, work, and even who they were allowed to sit beside. Backed by court decisions and enforced through Jim Crow laws, segregation was designed to maintain power by denying inequality. For black Americans, it meant unequal schools, limited opportunities, and constant reminders that the system was built against them. But segregation did not go unchallenged. During the civil rights movement, ordinary people, students, parents, pastors, and activists began to push back against injustice. Their resistance sparked a revolution, provoked intense reaction, and forced long overdue reform that would transform the nation and define what justice could look like in America. The fight against segregation was not led by one leader or one organization. It was driven by communities working together, parents filing lawsuits, students risking arrest, and activists organizing boycotts and protests. Churches became meeting spaces, schools became battlegrounds, and everyday actions became acts of resistance. Brown versus the Board of Education gave that movement legal momentum, but it also revealed the limits of the justice system. The ruling proved that change was possible, yet it also showed that laws alone could not force equality. True revolution required pressure, sacrifice, and courage from those most affected by segregation.
To understand the revolution, we must first understand what people were fighting against. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal facilities for black and white Americans were constitutional. This decision gave legal approval for segregation and opened the door for a web of discriminatory rules known as Jim Crow laws. Across the South, black Americans faced segregated schools, transportation, neighborhoods, and public services, none of which were ever truly equal. By the mid-20th century, frustration had turned into organized resistance. Black communities began demanding dignity, education, and basic human rights. The revolution ignited in classrooms. Black parents and students in states like Kansas, South Carolina, and Virginia challenged unequal schooling. Their fight led to the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, a case that would change history. The Supreme Court declared that separate schools were inherently unequal. It marked the first major victory against legalized segregation. For many, Brown was proof that the system could be changed. Yet Brown didn't instantly open school doors. Instead, it set off the next stage of the story, reaction.
The decision in Brown v. Board did not bring immediate change. It brought resistance. Southern states used every tool they could to block integration. Politicians wrote massive resistance manifestos, school boards delayed compliance, and white citizens formed councils to keep segregation alive. Some schools closed entirely rather than integrate. The Little Rock Nine carried the burden of Brown when they attempted to enter Central High School in 1957. Their walk-through, angry mobs, and National Guard opposition showed the world how far some were willing to go to maintain racial separation.
Resistance to integration was not limited to angry crowds or political speeches. It appeared in quieter ways as well. Through delayed court orders, redistricting plans, and unequal funding that continued to disadvantage black schools and neighborhoods. Even without explicit segregation laws, inequality persisted. These reactions revealed how deeply segregation was embedded in American society. The backlash was not just fear of change, but fear of losing control. Yet every act of resistance to equality exposed the injustice of the system and strengthened the resolve of the civil rights movement.
Across the South, violence increased. Churches were bombed, activists were harassed, students were threatened, and federal troops were often required to enforce even the smallest steps towards equal education. This intense reaction exposed the truth. Segregation had never been about equality, it had been about power. But the backlash didn't stop the movement, it fueled it.
Reform required more than legislation. It required enforcement. Federal courts, presidents, and activists had to work together to ensure that new laws were followed. Even then, progress was uneven, and many communities resisted compliance for years. Despite these challenges, reform marked a turning point. Legal segregation was dismantled, and future generations gained opportunities that long been denied. These reforms laid the foundation for continued civil rights efforts, influencing later movements for equality across race, gender, and class.
As protests grew and violence was televised, the federal government could no longer ignore the crisis. The nation was forced to confront the consequences of segregation and the tension it created. The push for reform gained momentum. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation in public facilities and made discrimination based on race illegal. A year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 attacked the voting restrictions that kept black voices silenced for generations. Schools slowly, often painfully, began to integrate. Jim Crow laws were struck down one by one. Court decisions, federal enforcement, and continued activism transformed the legal landscape of the United States. Reform did not eliminate racism, but it dismantled the legal structures that had maintained segregation for decades.
The legacy of segregation is still visible today in school systems, neighborhoods, and economic disparities, shaped by decades of unequal treatment. While the civil rights movement ended legalized segregation, the work of achieving true equality remains unfinished. By examining segregation through revolution, reaction, and reform, we gain a clearer understanding of how progress occurs. Change is not linear, nor is it easy. It is a result of persistence, resistance, and the willingness to change injustice even when the outcome is uncertain. The history of segregation reminds us that rights must be protected and progress must be maintained. The voices that rose during the civil rights movement continue to echo, urging each generation to confront inequality and push the nation closer to the ideals it promises.